Everyone is ahead of you. Or at least that's how it looks from here. 26 and already behind. 31 and still figuring it out. 40 and suddenly aware of how much time has already become the past. I know that feeling. Not from a distance, from inside it. There was a night, I won't tell you when, because the year doesn't matter, and the details would let you off the hook too easily, when I sat in a room and made a list. Not a goal list. A comparison list. Everyone I knew lined up against what they'd done, what they'd built, what they'd been handed, what they'd earned. And I put myself at the bottom. Methodically. Almost clinically. Like a man diagnosing himself with irrelevance. Here's the thing they never tell you about feeling behind. It isn't really about time. It's about the story you're using time to tell about yourself. And the most dangerous part of that story? It feels like math. Like objective fact. Like looking at a scoreboard you didn't choose to play on but are somehow losing anyway. But what if the scoreboard wasn't measuring the game you're actually in? What if the life that looks like falling behind is actually the only path that leads to the one you were supposed to build? There's something that happens when the comparison stops. Not because you forced it, but because something finally broke. Something underneath. And in that breaking, something true gets exposed. I'm not sure I've met anyone who changed their life from comfort. Real change, the kind that lasts, seems to come from the bottom of exactly this feeling. The behindness. The not enough yetness. The quiet, suffocating weight of a life that hasn't started looking like the version you imagined. Maybe you know exactly what I mean right now. Maybe that's why you're here. The comparison is never announced. It doesn't knock. It's just there one morning, a scroll through something, a casual conversation. A name that comes up attached to a number that means nothing and everything at the same time. And before you've even consciously registered it, the mechanism is already running. The internal calculation. The positioning of yourself relative to someone else's trajectory. The quiet, automatic asking, where am I in relation to that? We all do it. We've all been doing it since we were children, comparing height marks on door frames and test scores posted on classroom walls. The social comparison instinct is old, older than language, older than money, possibly as old as the species. It served us once. In small groups, on savannas, relative standing was survival information. Knowing where you fit determined what you got. But we are not on a savanna. And the group is no longer small. The group, now, is everyone. Everyone you went to school with. Everyone you've ever followed. Everyone who posts a win, a milestone, a launch, a life that looks like it's happening on schedule. And the comparison mechanism, the one designed for a tribe of 30, is now trying to process 7 billion data points simultaneously and tell you, with the same cave-era confidence, exactly where you rank. You were never going to win that calculation. No one does. I remember sitting across from someone once, a conversation I didn't plan to have, the kind that finds you, and they asked me something I wasn't ready for. Who told you this was the schedule? I didn't have an answer. Not a real one. I had a feeling, that familiar, shapeless certainty that I was behind, that things were supposed to look different by now, that the gap between where I was and where I should be was visible and embarrassing. But when they pushed me on where that certainty came from, I couldn't trace it. Not to anything real. It was assembled from parts, a comment someone made in passing, an article I read, a trajectory I witnessed and mistook for the norm, a cultural assumption so deep I'd never thought to question it. I had been losing a race I had accepted without ever seeing the starting gun. Here's what I want you to honestly examine. The people you're comparing yourself to. Do you actually want their life? Not the version you can see from the outside, the actual life, the private parts, the trade-offs they made to get to that milestone, the things they sacrificed or overlooked or quietly regret, the version they live in the morning before anyone's watching. Because the comparison never includes the full picture. It includes the highlight, the curated surface, the metric that translates cleanly into a scoreboard number. And it leaves out everything that doesn't, the cost, the compromise, the private version of success that looks nothing like the public one. You are not behind their highlight reel. You are living your whole life. Those are not comparable things. The comparison trap is not a character flaw. It's not a sign of weakness or insecurity or smallness. It's a design feature that outlived its usefulness. It was built for a different world, and it is running, full throttle, in a world it was never designed to navigate. But knowing that doesn't make it stop. And I won't pretend there's a clean-off switch. What there is, instead, is a different question you can start asking, not where am I relative to them, but relative to what I'm actually trying to build, am I moving? That question is harder to answer. It requires knowing what you're actually trying to build, which most people avoid thinking about precisely because thinking about it would mean being honest about how far the life they're living is from the life they actually want. But that honesty, uncomfortable as it is the only way out of the comparison trap. Because the trap only holds you if you're measuring yourself against a target you never chose. The moment you're clear on your own target, their scoreboard becomes irrelevant, not because you stopped caring, because you finally started caring about the right thing. You are not behind. You are on a different route. Those are completely different statements. One is a judgment. The other is just geography. And geography, unlike judgment, can be navigated. There is a game being played. You are in it. You did not agree to the rules. Most people go their entire lives without noticing that the game they're trying to win was designed by someone else, for purposes that have nothing to do with their own happiness or fulfillment, or the specific shape of life they were actually meant to live. The scoreboard is everywhere. It shows up in how we describe other people. He's really done well for himself. She's still figuring things out. They're behind where they should be. It shows up in the questions at family gatherings that feel harmless and mean everything. It shows up in the metrics we've absorbed without consent, the income brackets, the title progressions, the age by which checkboxes, the relationship timeline, the property ownership milestone, the body type that means you're winning the physical version. Someone assembled that scoreboard. Someone decided what counted and what didn't. Someone set the weightings, career over craft, income over autonomy, visible success over private meaning. And most of us stepped onto the field and started playing before we ever asked whose game this was. I played it. Hard. For a long time. I optimized for metrics I hadn't chosen. I chased milestones that made me look competent to people whose opinions I wasn't sure I valued. I made decisions based on how they'd appear in the scoreboard summary, the version of my life someone else would read and evaluate. And every step forward on that game board felt like progress, and somehow also like moving further from something I couldn't name. Because what I was moving further from was myself, the version of me that existed before the comparison, before the measurement, before I learned that certain things counted and other things didn't, and started arranging my life around that hierarchy. Do you know what that costs? Not in abstract terms. In the actual currency of your one life, do you know how much of it gets spent optimizing for a game you never chose? Here's the uncomfortable question. If no one could see your life, if there were no scoreboard, no comparison, no external measure of your progress or success, what would you actually be doing? What would matter? What would you spend the hours on? That question has an answer. It's usually not the same as the life we're living. And the gap between those two things, between the life built for the scoreboard and the life that would exist without it, is the exact measurement of how captured we are. I am not saying the scoreboard is entirely invented. Some of its metrics reflect real things: stability, contribution, sustainability. But the way the scoreboard is weighted, and who controls the weights, and what gets left off entirely, that part is constructed. That part is a choice made by people with interests that may or may not align with yours. The moment I started asking whose game is this, everything changed. Not immediately. Not in a clean, cinematic way. But gradually, the metrics I was chasing started to feel less inevitable and more optional. And once they felt optional, I could choose. You can choose too. But first you have to see the scoreboard clearly enough to recognize it isn't the truth. It's a version of the truth, someone else's version, that you've been handed and mistaken for objective reality. The game you're meant to play is different. It has different rules, different metrics, different definition of winning. And it's the only game where you have a real chance of playing to your actual capacity. Find it. Then play it with everything. When did you decide what on time meant? Not when did you first feel behind. I mean, when did you actually sit down, deliberately, with full awareness, and decide that by a specific age you were supposed to have accomplished a specific thing? When did you set that expectation consciously? You didn't. Almost no one does. The timeline was handed to you in pieces, cultural, familial, ambient. It accumulated in the background, below the threshold of decision, until one day you woke up with a fully formed conviction about what your life should look like by now. Where the relationships should be, what the career should look like, how much you should have saved, built, figured out. And none of it was chosen. It was absorbed. And now you're holding yourself to a deadline you never agreed to. I've thought about this a lot, about the people we hold up as examples, the ones who made it at an age that made everyone else uncomfortable, the ones whose early success became the unofficial bar. And what I've noticed is that for every one of those, there are dozens, hundreds of people who built something real and true and lasting, and did it on a timeline that looked, from the outside, like falling behind. Julia Child didn't publish her first cookbook until she was almost 50. Charles Darwin published his defining work at 50. Vera Wang didn't enter fashion until she was 39. These aren't consolation prizes for late starters. These are people who were doing the formation, the private, slow, unglamorous preparation, for exactly as long as it took, and then they built something that lasted. The timeline that said they were behind was wrong. Not partly wrong, completely wrong. What if the timeline that says you're behind is also wrong? I want to offer you something that took me too long to understand. There is no on time. There is only the sequence that things need to happen in for them to be real. And that sequence is different for every person, every vision, every life. It does not submit to a cultural schedule. It does not care about the age bracket assumptions of people who haven't built what you're building. The grief in this, and I want to acknowledge it, because it's real, is that some time has passed. Real time. Time you spent not on this. And there's a version of yourself that will carry that loss, that will sometimes grieve the earlier start you wish you'd had. That grief is legitimate. But grief and regret are not the same thing. Grief is about what happened. Regret is a story you tell about what it means. And the story that your timing makes you permanently less, that because you didn't start at 20 you can't arrive at 50, that story is simply false. You are not late. You are here. This is the starting point, not a deficit to overcome, not a debt to pay back, not a gap to apologize for. It is just where you are. And from here, the question is simply, what do you build? That question has no expiration date. I want to tell you something about the worst moment. Not the hardest moment. The worst one. The moment when the story you'd been telling about your potential finally ran out of road. When you couldn't keep deferring the reckoning. When the gap between where you were and where you'd always told yourself you were heading became impossible to rationalize. That moment is the beginning. Most people experience it as an ending, which is why they miss what it's offering. Here is what rock bottom actually is. It is the first moment of your life in which you have no choice but to be honest. Every defense has been stripped away. Every story has collapsed. Every narrative you built to protect yourself from the truth of where you actually are, gone. And what's left is just you, in a room, with the facts. That sounds like a disaster. And in the moment, it feels like one. But here's what I've come to believe, based on watching people, including myself, move through it. The honesty that lives at the bottom is more valuable than almost anything else you could possess. Because you cannot build something real on a false foundation. And for as long as you were above the bottom, still managing the story, still maintaining the comfortable distance between the life you were claiming and the life you were actually living, you were building on sand. At the bottom, you build on rock. Because there is nothing left to pretend. I've watched people hit bottom and come back as something unrecognizable. Not because they found motivation, not because they had some cinematic breakthrough, but because the bottom removed every option except honesty. And honesty, it turns out, is the rarest and most powerful building material available. When did you last let yourself be completely honest about where you are? Not the version you present, not the working through some things framing, the actual, uncomfortable, specific truth. This is where I am. This is what I haven't done. This is what hasn't worked. This is what I'm afraid of. This is what I've been avoiding. Most people never go there. They manage the story so effectively that they never have to face the bottom. And they also, consequently, never have access to what the bottom offers. They stay in the middle, comfortable enough to avoid the truth, not quite desperate enough to demand it. There is a cost to that. The cost is the life you could have built if you'd been willing to start from honesty instead of management. I am not romanticizing suffering. I am not saying you need to destroy yourself to build something. What I'm saying is simpler and harder the moment you stop managing the narrative and start engaging with the truth, all of it, including the parts that embarrass you, is the moment real change becomes possible. The bottom is not the end of your story, it is the first line of the true version. And true versions, however late they arrive, however unglamorous the start, have a way of going somewhere that the managed ones never do. Start from here. Start from exactly this. Don't wait for better circumstances or more resources or a more flattering position from which to begin. The bottom is the beginning. The only one that's real. At some point the noise stops. Not because it was silenced. Not because you solved the comparison or conquered the timeline or argued yourself out of the feeling of being behind. But because something underneath it all finally gets answered, some question you didn't know you were asking, and in that answering, the noise loses its grip. The question is always some version of this. Am I living something that is actually mine? And the answer, when it comes, is always followed by the same fork. Either yes, with the quiet grounded recognition that you are where you should be, Building what you're meant to build, or no, which is not a failure, but an instruction. A direction. The most important piece of information you'll ever receive. I spent years living a life I was performing. Not lying, exactly, but not fully there, either. There was always a small part of me observing, the watcher at the window, asking whether this was it. Whether this was the actual life, or the rehearsal. Whether the real version was somewhere else. Waiting. That gap between the life you're performing and the life that's actually yours has a cost that doesn't show up in any metric. You can't put it on a scoreboard. You can't measure it in income or title or follower count. But you feel it. You feel it in the specific way you slow down before certain tasks, the way certain Sundays carry a particular weight, the way you can go a whole day surrounded by people and still feel alone in some essential way. That feeling is not depression. It's not ingratitude. It's information. It's your life, trying to tell you something. And what it's trying to tell you is this. There is a version of this, a version of you, that is more aligned with what you actually are. Not a perfect version. Not a solved version. But a truer one. And every day you spend performing the version that doesn't fit is a day you are not in the work of building the one that does. The life that was always yours doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It shows up in the small moments, the conversation that doesn't feel like effort, the problem that pulls you in instead of pushing you away, the work that makes time disappear, the version of yourself in those moments that feels, somehow, more like you than the version everyone else is watching. Notice those moments. They are not accidents. They are the direction. I am not here to tell you that feeling behind doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you that it's been answering the wrong question. The question isn't, are you behind? The question is, behind on whose timeline, toward whose definition of ahead, measured by whose idea of success? When you answer those questions honestly, when you trace the standards you've been held to, and discover who actually set them, you often find that they have very little to do with the life you were actually meant to build. And once you see that, the behindness doesn't go away. But it changes. It stops being a verdict and starts being a starting point. The place from which the true version begins. You are not behind. You are exactly where the truth about your life has brought you. And the truth, however late it arrives, is always the right starting point. Start building the life that was always yours. The comparison can't follow you there.